Christian education at this log cabin school, which still stands to this day. In Fredericksburg, he attended regularly at St. George's Anglican Church. When, as a young man, Washington inherited Mount Vernon, several miles to the north, he also made the regular trek to church in good weather and bad. Attending church became a lifelong habit of Washington's, even after Virginia abolished its state church in 1786.
Washington was a strong believer. Now, you've got to be careful about him, because he didn't go around talking about Jesus. He didn't wear it on his sleeve. He was private about his beliefs. So that's why you have to do some real digging with him. But the man was, in my view, a very strong believer.
He always attended churches when he could in the Army, and when he was president, he regularly attended Christ Church.
Dr. James H. Hudson is the head of the manuscript division for the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C.
He was a vestryman and we have records of his attendance at vestry meetings.
Deists often claim that Washington was not a real Christian, but the burden of proof is on them to explain why this man would always be in church, why the churches he was part of were entirely orthodox in terms of Trinity and the doctrine of Christ, why they would preach the Bible regularly on Sunday.
Dr. Peter Lilback has conducted a great deal of painstaking research on George Washington's faith. We met with him on the grounds of one of Washington's own Anglican churches, Pohick Church in Lorton, Virginia, relatively close to Mount Vernon.
We are in one of the most historic churches in all of America. This is Pohick Church, an Episcopal church, but it's the church where George Washington himself worshiped. It's a church where he was a vestryman and a warden.
George Washington frequently used the Church of England's 1662 Book of Common Prayer for his own prayer life, and he was a regular reader of the Scriptures.
I've gone through his writings, and I've counted some 70 or 80 biblical allusions that come right into his writings.
George Washington's home was Mount Vernon, several miles from Washington, D.C. Mount Vernon is perhaps the most visited home in the United States. If you visit his tomb on the grounds of Mount Vernon, you can see this statement of faith, based on the Gospel of John, chapter 11, wherein Jesus declares that he is our hope for eternal life.
For about the last 40 years, the standard interpretation has been that George Washington was a deist.
Mary Thompson is the official research specialist at Mount Vernon.
I started researching about 7 years ago his religious beliefs in order to answer an inquiry from a visitor. And what I found very early on was that this was a man who believed that God took an active part in the founding of the United States, a man who believed that God took an active interest in people's lives, and that the way a person behaved in reference to God would influence how God related to him. And that's not the belief of a deist.
As Commander-in-Chief of the military, George Washington believed strongly in religious disciplines. He insisted on chaplains.
One of the things that Washington said as a general, when you're facing an enemy, you want to make sure you can put the enemy in the wrong so that God will be on your side, because God stands with the righteous. And righteousness for Washington was defined by the eternal rules of heaven, these 10 commandments, and he was very careful to follow them.
After the disastrous winter of Valley Forge, 1777 to 78, a time in which the troops were sustained in part by prayer, General Washington wrote his men and advised them,
"To the distinguished character of a patriot, it ought to be our highest glory to add the more distinguished character of a Christian."
He once wrote the following words to a group of Indians who wanted help on educating their children.
"You do well to wish to learn our arts and ways of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ. Congress will do everything they can to assist you in this wise intention."
No one can dispute that Washington spoke about providence all the time. But what did he mean by that term?
Providence comes up in Washington's writings over 200 times. It's spectacular. They're not just in public letters, as it's often been said, that speechwriters put those words in his mouth. Now, these are private letters, individual statements, as he is carefully trusting in God.
I would think that God and providence are synonymous in Washington's mind. When you look at a number of the letters, it becomes obvious that he feels that providence is all-knowing, all-wise, that providence is involved in what happens in the world.
All the objections to Washington as a Christian have essentially ripped him out of his late 18th century Anglican tradition. A review of the evidence shows a man with deep-seated Christian convictions and practices.
George Washington must be viewed as one of the finest Christian statesmen that America has ever seen. But when you look at a man who said, "My creed is not words, but deeds," take a look at his deeds. And his deeds at every point represent a man who's deeply committed to the Christian faith.
It was here in historic Yorktown, Virginia, that General George Washington defeated the British and secured our liberties back in 1781. Behind me is Grace Church, which along with the rest of this town suffered through that siege. Washington said that God's help to the American cause was so conspicuous that one must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith, and more than wicked that has not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. In other words, America, according to the father of our country, owes a debt of gratitude to God for its very existence. But how can modern Americans understand such a debt when they don't even know our true history? They can't. And that's why I'm bringing you this program today and airing it across the nation so that as many people as possible will know the truth. This is a wake-up call. Without the underpinning of the Christian faith, our liberties are not guaranteed. Did you catch that? Without the Christian faith, our liberties are not guaranteed. Because the moment we believe our freedoms come from the government, those freedoms can be taken away. And it's already happening. That's why it's so important that we get this message out to as many people as possible. And that's where you can help. If you're able to give a gift of $25 or more to help me to continue to produce programs like this and continue the work of this ministry, I want to say thank you by sending you a copy of today's special broadcast on either VHS or DVD. The video you'll receive contains additional information that you won't see during this broadcast. I urge you to pass it on to friends, family, your pastor, or educator that you know. Help get the truth out. The address is this: James Kennedy, Box 555, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, 33302. Or to give using a credit card, just call toll-free 1-888-334-9680. Dear friend, the facts about America's Christian heritage speak for themselves. And that's why when you send your gift of $25 or more, I'll also include the book One Nation Under God by David Gibbs Jr. and Jerry Newcomb. Inside, you'll discover 10 things that every Christian should know about the founding of America. This is another great resource to pass along to others. And as you do, in a sense, you'll be joining our forefathers in helping to preserve liberty for our future generations. That address again is James Kennedy, Box 555, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, 33302. Or call 1-888-334-9680. Or you can go to our secure website at www.crm.tv.
Farrell Till, editor of the Skeptical Review, writes, quote, "The primary leaders of the so-called founding fathers of our nation were not Bible-believing Christians, they were deists."
As we've seen, George Washington was certainly no deist. Yet, the notion persists that the vast majority